session dives into one of the most pressing and provocative conversations in publishing today: diversity, sensitivity, censorship, and free expression. So Adam Szetela is a writer and scholar and cultural critic with a PhD in English from Cornell University. He's the author of That Book is Dangerous: How Moral Panic, Social Media, and the Culture Wars Are Remaking Publishing. An expose revealing the censorship happening behind closed doors in America's largest publishers, literary agencies, and creative writing programs, all in the name of sensitivity and diverse representation. Published in 2025, August, That Book is Dangerous has been described as fiery and insightful by the Washington Post, engaging by The Economist, and a cutting debut by Publishers Weekly. In addition, his book, Adam's work appears in leading outlets including The Washington Post, The Guardian, and Newsweek. So, in this fireside chat, That Book is Dangerous: Censorship, Culture Wars, and the Fight for Publishing's Future, Adam's going to unpack the forces shaping the stories that get told and what stories are silenced in today's publishing world. So please join me in welcoming Adam Szetela with any emojis. So thanks, Adam. Nice to have you joining us today for an honest discussion on some sensitive topics. But I think the intention here is to learn from you and discuss with you, maybe debate a little, and hopefully everyone, regardless of their background and perspective, comes away with some interesting insights. So let's swing away, and we've got the Q&A, so I encourage anyone with questions as we go. Adam's not particularly sensitive himself, my understanding is, so feel free to pitch some hard-hitting questions his way, and I'm sure he'll be happy to answer those. So Adam, let's start with your journey here, because it sounds like this has been a while, this project for you. Tell us about the moment when how you got into this topic and how you realized That Book is Dangerous had to be written.
Yeah, thanks. So I would say around the early 2010s, but really picking up around like 2015, 2016. I was seeing news stories about books being canceled, and I don't use that verb metaphorically. I'm talking like quite literally canceled. So I'd be reading the New York Times or the Post, and they'd be doing a story about a book that was supposed to come out in March, but the publisher canceled it in January because people were upset about arcs that were circulating, or even in some cases, a book would be published, but then the publisher would pull it from circulation, or Amazon would remove it, or eBay would remove it. And the sort of common denominator with these books, there's a few exceptions, but for the most part, these were books written by people who would identify as progressive, being accused of other progressives for essentially not being progressive enough. So the accusations span the realm of racism or sexism or transphobia, homophobia. They were not genre specific. There's picture books, there's young adult books, there's nonfiction, journalism. And I'd say around 2018, 2019, I started thinking about writing about this. I think at the time I was thinking about maybe writing a feature article. It's kind of my background is in journalism and cultural criticism. But the main question that started my project that ultimately turned into a book that I worked on for multiple years was essentially, if this is what I know about as someone who does not work in publishing, then surely these controversies have to be shaping things behind closed doors, whether it's acquisition practices, editing policies, what's going on inside agencies. So I spent a few years just really trying to get on the phone, get on Zoom, talk in person with people in really every corner of publishing. So I've talked to presidents and vice presidents of imprints at the big five publishers. I've talked to people at indie publishers. I've talked to people, really some of the most prominent agents right now. I've talked to editors. I've talked to, authors who have been New York Times bestsellers, who've won National Book Awards. And my book is kind of sort of an expose of what has been going on behind closed doors. in response to sort of the social media call out.
Okay, and you touched a bit there on your research process. Maybe just elaborate a little bit more, like who you talked to, who you interviewed, how long did it take those interviews, and these are big publishers or small publishers, and tell us a bit more about that kind of investigative journey. How did you get access to these people? How was that?
Yeah, so at the time I was also pursuing my PhD in English at Cornell. So the research I did for this book got approved through what's known as the IRB process. So like everyone I interviewed, I had to complete, informed consent forms. They had to sign off on them, before I talked. I had to get secondary approval of, is it all right for me to record this stuff? So, at the time it was a very academic project that I sort of translated into a general readership for my book. But in terms of, who I talked to, kind of, as I mentioned, people really in every corner of publishing, from literary agencies to big five publishers, editors, people in the sales departments. All my interview subjects are anonymous in the book, and if you read the book, you'll probably quickly realize why that is, because many of them are critical of certain trends in publishing and also worried about airing their criticism publicly. For me, there's kind of like two general methods for getting people to talk to you. So, I mean, I have literally reached out to hundreds of people in publishing. The overwhelming majority of people don't respond to you because they're busy or they're not interested in the topic or what have you. But you do get enough people, and then when I would get on the phone with people, we use what in academic research we would call a snowball sample, which is like if I'm talking to Tim and Tim works at Penguin Random House, and maybe Tim is like, "Oh, you have to talk to my colleague in sales. She thinks a lot about this." I would use those connections. So yeah, I spent a few years talking to people, beginning in 2020 through about I think like spring 2023, and then my book came out in August.
Okay, so and a lot of authors and people care a lot about not punching down, right? For people who
Mhm.
are marginalized and so on. And you discuss statistics in your book about representation. You start with it, you end with it, and you quote one novelist you interviewed who says, quote, there are people whose voices have been left out for a century or more. They've effectively been canceled for a good long time. So, your book's an expose and a critique of things gone too far, but maybe if we can start by just, pretending you're the world's best advocate for more diverse books and sensitively reading, what is the case that you would make there as a starting point?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, there's a reason that I start my book off on that note, right? So it's absolutely true. I mean, it does not matter what data set you look at. So you could look at data of who actually works in publishing, right, down to the granular level of who are presidents of imprints at the big five publishers, who are editors, et cetera. Kind of what, regardless of what data you're looking at, how whether it's from last year or 5 years ago or 10 years ago, the running you know, image that you'll see is that for decades, publishing has historically been dominated by white people, cisgender people. In certain like the upper echelons, it tends to be more male orientated, right? When you look at particularly in big five publishing, who has historically gotten contracts for books, right? There's a clear racial variance to this stuff. So, people have understandably pointed out the underrepresentation of people from certain marginalized backgrounds, both within the ranks of publishing, and by publishing I mean in sort of a broad sense, also talking about literary agencies, but also in terms of again who's actually getting contracts for books, what sort of stories are being told, right? So I mean, you could go back more than a century. So like if you go back to the early 1900s, W.B. Du Bois was writing about the same stuff. He was like, kind of, where are all the positive stories about African American kids and stuff? So people have been having this conversation for a while. I kind of make the argument in my book that social media was very much a galvanizing force in terms of drawing attention to this issue. So, whether it was diverse pitch trending or we need diverse books or what have you, social media, especially Twitter, or X now, was really, I think, really a big mover in terms of getting both the publisher's attention as well as the public's attention, right? So all of a sudden it was like the Washington Post and New York Times publishing articles like, where are all the black kids in picture books, or what have you, right? So I think it's important to um think about that history, right? And it's not history that like we have moved past right now, right? Because I think that the core of this sort of current concern over books, right? That is a big part of it, right? So that for me is kind of the issue of diversity. Now, the issue of sensitivity is a bit different. The issue of sensitivity is more a question of not just like who's occupying these roles, who's getting book contracts, what are books about, but how are African Americans represented in books? How are queer people represented in books, right? But these two questions are intertwined, right? Because as people have pointed out, right, you know, how do you think, for example, African Americans are going to be represented, right? When it's like the majority of books about African Americans are written by white guys or what have you, you can kind of point at different demographics, right? But those two conversations, again, have been going on for more than a century, but particularly in like the early 2010s, picking up, they really start trending on social media. And one of the things that my book looks at is, for better or worse, people, I'll leave that up to the people to decide. It does get wedded to sort of a punitive component. So it wasn't just a question of like, this book tokenized African Americans or what have you. Is it was often wedded to, we need to cancel this book or remove this book from distribution for reasons X, Y, and Z.
You say that whereas diversity is a quantitative problem, sensitivity is a qualitative problem. Want to elaborate on that?
Yeah. So, again, like we can look at the statistics and we could say, whatever it is, 79% of editors at like Penguin Random House are white or what have you, right? And people have been pointing out that data and saying like, no, we need more African American women. We need people of different demographics, particularly because we know that people's identities, at least to a certain extent, do shape the kinds of stories that they accept and want to publish and things like that. So that's, I mean, that's like a quantitative thing that you can document in a very empirical way. Now the sensitivity thing, that's again, as I understand it, more of a qualitative question, right? So for example, right, I could write a book about an African American protagonist growing up in Boston in low income housing, right? Um and as people would rightfully point out, right, I think there's accurate, inaccurate ways to do that, authentic, inauthentic ways that are gonna, recycle stereotypes and ways that are not gonna do that. So especially when you start looking at some of the controversies that have led to books being the subject of ire. A lot of those controversies revolve around folks sort of writing outside of their own demographic identity and being accused of getting it wrong, of not doing their homework, of not doing their research, of being offensive to groups.
So yeah, there's going to be this question of how far something that could be well intentioned, can it go too far? When does it go too far? Where's the balance? So why don't you dig in? I know your book starts with several examples. Why don't you give an example of where things may have gone too far? In your introduction, you include some, so maybe pick one that illustrates the point.
Yeah, sure. So I mean, there's kind of like an innumerable number of ones at this point, but one that was very striking to me, and also very representative, right? Early 2019, you had an author that I'm sure some folks will be familiar with because she has gone on to be successful and write even more books. Her name's Amelia Wenzhou, right? And she was born in China, She's Chinese American. I think she was working in finance at the time, but she was very fortunate. She got a book deal with Penguin Random House. From my understanding, they were expecting it to sell well, and really hyping it up. And this was her debut book. It was a fantasy book. And in early 2019, people started posting screenshots of the book's description on Twitter. And in the book's description, her fantasy world is described as a world in which slavery exists, but it's not slavery based off race or the color of people's skin or what have you. It's kind of like this colorblind slavery, and people are posting screenshots of this book that had not come out yet, and accusing Amelia Wenzel of appropriating African American slavery. It was this idea, I guess, that slavery is something distinct to African Americans, and that as someone who was not African American, she was sort of like taking that story, right? Accusations of cultural appropriation. She got accusations that she was sort of like whitewashing slavery and sort of promoting nefarious kind of color blindness. So, just for context, this is an author who, as far as I can tell, is, very left of center, really cares about issues of diversity, sensitivity, those sorts of things. But in response to that criticism, the New York Times reported that Penguin Random House had canceled the publication date of the book. They were planning to send the book to sensitivity readers. It was eventually released, and it came out, right? But one of the most striking things about that example is that there was another author, whose name is Cosco Jackson, who is involved in the group of people criticizing Penguin Random House, criticizing Amelia Wenzel for quote unquote getting it wrong, for cultural appropriation stuff. He himself, also an author of color, he himself is a sensitivity reader for Big Five publishers. So, like, his job, quite literally, is to ensure books are sensitive and not offensive. And just a few months after she and Penguin Random House canceled her book, he canceled his own book when something very similar happened to him. Before it was coming out, people started accusing his book of insensitivities, of his depiction of a Muslim character. He himself, from what I remember, is not Muslim. And his book was never published. That was his debut book, and it never saw the light of day. You can maybe find like an ARC on kind of the black market. I was able to get my hands on one, but it was very striking at the time because, again, these were two authors of color, debut authors who, again, as far as I can tell, very much left in terms of cultural issues and things like that. And that's what happened in their books. And, myself, as well as a number of other people, I think were looking on, particularly in the case of Cosco Jackson, and essentially saying, if this guy can't get it right, and he's literally a sensitivity reader for Big Five publishers and someone like very active in this conversation about diverse sensitive books. If he can't get it right, sort of like, what hope do the rest of us have,
And I'm going to ask them about censorship later on, but I'm just thinking how in the traditional publishing model versus self-publishing, traditional publishing model is where it would be more inclined to become censorship because they're the ones making the decision, whereas on the self-publishing side, it could be more like a beta reader, someone who's, or even an editor. They're giving their perspective. They're maybe flagging issues for you to think about, but ultimately the author is in control. But you're really looking at the traditional side of industry where it's the publisher who is making that decision. So you use terms like essentialism, presentism, boulderizing. You want to touch on maybe what some of these pieces are? And this is in your chapter on sort of the ideas of this sensitivity era that you discuss.
Yeah, so I'll start with essentialism, right? So something that has become very prominent on the left in recent years, even though, historically, I think it was actually people on the right who were sort of pushing this stuff. It's this idea that marginalized communities are sort of like these bounded groups that share perspectives and a culture and what have you, right? Now, obviously, like, you can make an argument about that to a certain extent, depending on what group of people you're talking about, what culture, right? But particularly in like the environment of social media where like the intellectual like level of this stuff sort of drops down a hundredfold. One thing you're seeing a lot is people sometimes quite explicitly purporting to read how a book would affect millions of people they have never read. So like the classic thing would be like, as a gay man, this is offensive to the quote unquote gay community, or as an African American, like this is going to be offensive to black people or what have you, right? No, again, like a lot of this is like case specific, right? But one of the things that came up in my interviews, and as coming up, in writers like John McWhorter at the New York Times and other folks, is that there's this tendency to treat people from marginalized groups in a way that one would never treat white men, for example, right? So like it would sound preposterous to me if I was like, your book's going to be offensive to white men. And, you'd probably respond, well, there's millions of white men like who share different politics and things like that. And the same is true for African Americans or gay people or what have you, right? I have friends who are African American, who are conservative. I have friends who are progressive, right? But there's been this sort of idea that people could be sort of like representatives and spokespeople for these communities. And this ties into a lot of what publishers have been trying to do with sensitivity readers, which is like hiring people who they think could sort of like represent how a really big demographic of people are going to respond to a book. And ironically enough, this has actually, and this comes up a lot in my interviews, this has like created a lot of frustrations for authors who are part of the very groups that are ostensibly supposed to benefit from this. Um, I could talk more about that, but that issue of essentialism is something that is very prominent and manifests in all sorts of different ways, right? So it's not just social media conversations; it's also editors inside publishing houses who see the African American writer writing a memoir as representative of African American people broadly, and then rejecting another African American writer because they're saying like, "Hey, we have our African American memoir for fall 2026 or whatever."
So on the one hand, somebody just because they reflect a certain set of identities, they don't speak for them all, of course, but maybe it's still better than nothing to at least have a perspective that might be rooted in that. Would you say?
Yeah, I mean, so like, I mean, to like steelman this, right? So like, I give this example in my book, right? If I am, Adam Szetela, I live in Wisconsin, right? If I, for whatever reason, am writing about, people live in northern Italy right now, and I've never been there, and whatever, I would probably want to interview people who live there to like understand the culture, the food, the mannerisms, what have you. At least I would probably want to be reading memoirs or ethnographic work and stuff like that. I think that's sort of the kernel of where this stuff comes from, right? But it then balloons into, a really diverse range of other things, right? So, I mean, you have people who are, posting on X or even talking to editors at publishers who would say things like, oh, an African American person would never say that, or a woman in 1950s would like never behave like that, right? And I actually quote Zadie Smith, who has written about this kind of extensively, and she's like, how could you possibly say something so grand sweeping like that, unless you have like a fixed caricature already in mind of, again, this like enormous demographic.
You give an example, I forget what it is, but it was a gay author who's writing about the gay community, but then they had some sensitivity reading in that was he felt just going over the top, and he was trying to kind of be sensitive to it, but also rejecting it ultimately. What was that one?
Yeah, so I mean, this was an author, a gay author. From my understanding, I had interviewed his editor, and apparently this author was writing about a very a specific moment in his life in gay history. It was about gay men. And I guess a sensitivity reader was brought in who started sort of putting in other categories of queerness into this book, and transness. And the author was kind of pushed back and was like, this is not what my book is about. This is not what my experience was about, right? But it was this idea that to only focus on gay men in this novel was itself kind of like a kind of marginalization, marginalizing these other groups, right? But ironically, the gay author himself felt like his experience was being marginalized in an attempt to like sort of like expand the, for lack of a better word, progressive window of
Mhm.
identities.
Do you want to touch on presentism and boulderizing? Those are
Sure.
new words to me, and then I want to get into some politics.
Yeah, so bowdlerization, the etymology of that word comes from a guy, Dr. Thomas Boulder, who took it upon himself to edit Shakespeare's work, which he felt was sort of not suited well enough for the public. But presentism is this idea that we should always be evaluating literary works by present moral standards, right? So someone could say, like, Huck Finn was progressive in its time, but it's not progressive now. It's actually racist, and therefore we shouldn't be assigning it in K through 12 schools, or we shouldn't be republishing it or what have you, right? Now, another element of that is. And this becomes very relevant for authors who are working in the realm of historical fiction. So, one thing that came up a lot in my interviews is there's this sort of tension between present moral standards and the focus of historical fiction, right? So if I'm writing, even we don't have to go back too far, right? If I'm writing a book set in Jim Crow America, or if you want to go further back to like Reconstruction or what have you, um, especially if I'm writing about sort of the politics of that time, right? I'm probably going to have virulent racist characters in that book, right? They're probably going to say and do racist things. But this has become sort of a tension between authors on the one hand, and I think the people inside publishing, especially the people who deal on like sort of like the marketing and sales end, right? Because they have told me like if that book gets screenshotted, a month before publication or weeks before publication, and like racist dialogue is now posted on Twitter and stuff, it's this association of racist characters, with the author, or with the book itself, right? So I think people are treading very carefully around some of these issues, but as people have pointed out, one of the effects is in certain contexts, there's been a certain like whitewashing, ironically enough, when it comes to historical fiction, right? So, kind of like toning things down in a way that will not be offensive to the present day sort of moral sensibilities. So the extreme example would be like New South Books republishing Mark Twain's work and removing words like the N word, but also other words, like replacing the word Indian with I think they use like Native American or something like that. That's just one example, but it's this idea that even works from the past need to be edited to sort of fit current moral standards. Another example, one of my favorites, is Roald Dahl's work. So if you read like the original, Willy Wonka story, it's not Oompa Loompas, it's African pygmies. At some point, they got edited out, and now it's Oompa Loompas. But that book has like been consistently edited every decade, according to sort of trending moral standards. So the most recent edits, they edited out, I think it was I haven't read the book in a while, Augustus Gloop, the sort of large boy who, if I remember correctly, gets caught in a chocolate pipe. So he was originally described, I think, as like a fat, obnoxious boy, and in the most recent incarnation, they just described him as like a bigger boy. So I guess as not to offend along lines of body weight or what have you. But the point is like sort of these edits, the boulderization, it is kind of like a treadmill that never turns off, and it just sort of changes according to, what people are concerned about in the present moment.
So let's talk. And I know left and right is definitions are always changing and are often not very good. But censorship and book bans, is it a right wing thing or a left wing thing? Who's worse? And what is the right focused on? Where are they influential? What does the left focus on? Where are they influential? You want to try to unpack that a little bit? Because
Yeah.
I'm sure there are people who follow it closely and will see it from one perspective or the other. Maybe you can summarize some of those pieces.
Yeah, 100%. I think that's a great question. So when I think about right and left, I think they have different concerns when it comes to the books that they want to remove from the public. They have very different concerns. I also think they have different strategies for doing that. So if you look at the right, what are they concerned about? They're concerned about critical race theory, a term that's been divorced from its original academic legal context and now can constitute everything from, Ibram X. Kennedy's picture book to, a book about Martin Luther King Jr. They're especially concerned if you look at the most frequently challenged books in K through 12 schools, anything to do with sexuality, right? So anything that is, in their words, promoting the trans agenda or the gay agenda or what have you. Those are their foci, right? Now, in terms of how they go about censoring, for them, it's a game of legislative censorship. So if you look at organizations like American Library Association, PEN America, National Coalition Against Censorship, they've done a really good job of tracking this stuff for decades, looking at the most frequently challenged books, tracking especially in recent years, really the hundreds of pieces of legislation that have popped up all around the United States targeting K through 12 schools, right? They also, from my understanding, even though these are ostensibly like grassroots groups like Moms for Liberty, for example. I think there's probably a lot of astroturfing that goes on in the sense of like funding these local parent groups who then show up at like school board meetings to try to get a book removed or what have you. I mean, you could find some pretty viral YouTube videos of outraged parents who are upset because their kid had to read a book about two gay dads or whatever. So that is their terrain. I think they've been very effective over recent years. Now the left, on the other hand, right? The left's concerns are totally different. The left's concerns are racism, sexism, transphobia, homophobia, Islamophobia, sort of all the isms and phobias. Now the thing about them is, if you try to find bills regarding this stuff, you're gonna have a very hard time. Um, their method of dealing with books, and I would just say for better or worse, it's through something that like sociologists would call like soft power, right? So they're not trying to pass a piece of legislation that gets, just name your book, Huck Finn removed from the K through 12 syllabi. They're instead like targeting authors themselves, they're targeting publishers, they're targeting agencies. That's kind of how they operate, right? So they've been very effective in using social media to draw attention to the books that they don't want to see. As far as on my end, like, having interviewed people in publishing, the publishers are not concerned about people on the right. There was even an interview where I asked a president at a big five publisher, I was kind of like, what happens when you guys publish a book that upsets conservatives, especially religious conservatives, right? Because you published a children's book about a trans character or what have you. And he kind of just laughed. He was like, yeah, that outrage does not affect the work that we do. That's not like shaping our acquisition practices or what have you. He was actually like, a lot of people actually, because publishing overall is very left of center, he's like, a lot of people actually take pride in publishing a book that upsets, conservative parents or what have you, because it feels like they're doing good work. So that's, I think, the landscape that we're in right now. I personally don't think of it as like one side is censoring and the other side's not censoring. I think both sides have made attempts to really restrict and control what other people read. Now again, if you're obviously talking about legislative censorship, I think there's a clear winner there. If you're talking about who has more influence, inside the decision-making process at like Harper, Penguin, Random House, I don't think it's conservatives. I think that's the reality of where we are right now.
Right. Depending on the side, books are turning people into gays or Marxists or homophobes or witches or racists. Um, and I guess I would say I want to you shed some interesting insight on the politics of it in the US. I would say it's maybe a little different in Canada because we have hate speech laws, and so there would be the legislative component maybe on the left. So both in our province and Canada, there will be debates about that and how hate is defined and whether it's sort of anybody can report it or whether there's different checks and balances. Those are um, probably issues that relate indirectly to the sphere. So a little different in Canada versus the US there on those topics. Okay, you talk about how cancel culture and the term canceling is contested. But you really dig into how it's great for conservatives in the US. And you are in Boston. Where are you, Adam?
I've lived in Boston. I currently reside in a rural part of the U.S., Madison, Wisconsin. It's like in the
Okay.
center. Yeah.
So, yeah, you talk about how cancel culture is political correctness when it comes to surveying sort of the broader populace in the US. It's kind of it's a winning issue for Republicans. Do you want to unpack that a little bit? Because
Yeah.
that's sort of interesting, for someone who is potentially progressive or to, understand maybe at least in the US, how it's landing on the public ear and how it's being used politically, potentially for political gain strategically.
Yeah, yeah. So, to anyone who is skeptical of the idea that whatever you want to call it, wokeness, cancel culture, hypersensitivity. I'll just stick with wokeness because that's the common term. Anyone who's skeptical that wokeness has contributed to the rise of Donald Trump and a lot of like what I would consider right-wing populist movements in the US and other countries. It's very easy, just go and plug in Donald Trump's campaign speeches leading up to the 2016 election, 2020 election, 2024, even the 2024 election. Just plug them into Grok, ChatGPT, and just do like a keyword analysis of it. It's very clear what Donald Trump was campaigning on. Now, free speech, wokeness, political correctness, obviously that was not his only issue. But I mean, the sheer amount of times that he talks about this stuff, even going so far as to forecast what we're seeing in the US right now. He has a campaign speech where he says we can play the game better than them, i.e., we can cancel people better than the left cancels people, right? This was a I think a winning strategy for him. So like one of the things that I sort of coalesce in my book is just the sheer amount of public opinion data, mostly from the US, about just how poorly wokeness, cancel culture, all this stuff polls among people. It polls really, really poorly. And there's a leading Democratic strategist in our country, James Carville, who's involved going all the way back to helping Bill Clinton win the White House. And he said something that I agree with really 100%, that cancel culture is one of the very rare political issues where the right can take a very, very hard line on it without losing voters in the middle. So, even when you were thinking about Dr. Seuss Enterprises choosing to cease publication of 5 books that were deemed problematic, it was almost surreal to me to turn on Fox News and see like Tucker Carlson talking about this, or just the sheer amount of media attention devoted to it. But the thing is, if you're a Republican pundit, if you're a strategist, I mean, I think this is a really great strategy, right? There's been so many people who, not just in the social survey sort of like mass data sets, but people who are on the ground, like interviewing conservatives interviewing people who actually voted for Obama and then switched to Trump. Political correctness is one of the main issues, right? Robbie Suave, who's a conservative journalist, he went to CPAC, the big conservative conference, and he reported, talking to young people in particular, he said, with the possible exception of immigration, there was no issue more important to these people than political correctness and free speech, right? Now, obviously, like, there's people probably listening to me right now who are like, but the right censors people all the time. And, just look at how many people have lost their jobs or otherwise been reprimanded for what they have said about Charlie Kirk or what have you, right? So I'm personally not saying, the right is the vanguard of free speech and stuff like that, but I will say that they consciously or not very much took advantage of the public's disdain for wokeness, political correctness, what have you. And again, like, if you don't believe me, just, go read Donald Trump's campaign speeches. Even if you look at his cabinet, right? So like someone like Pete Hegseth, Department of Defense, now known as the Department of War, right? He was a virtual unknown until he wrote a book about wokeness in the military. That was a New York Times bestseller. I think a #1 New York Times bestseller. You're in Canada, right? How many people knew who Jordan Peterson was 10 years ago? He was an obscure academic. I was in academia. I had never heard of him. And then, he publishes one YouTube video criticizing pronouns, and now his book sold over 10 million copies. So, I think, again, I think there's like sort of moral lines of argumentation you can make about this, but there's also pragmatism and practical strategy. And I think the right has practically done a very effective job of campaigning around this stuff.
You mentioned there's a survey, 37,000 students, 80% report censoring their viewpoints at their colleges at least some of the time. There's one with Clinton versus Trump, sample of thousands, where the sound majority favored Clinton, but when they were primed to think about norms constricting communication, PC norms, that gap disappeared. So it was one that rallies the base on the right, and it also maybe wins over people in the middle or a little bit there. On the other hand, just in terms of the contestation of even the language around cancel culture, some people might say you're using the word cancel culture.
Sure.
You quote, one person saying it's a white supremacist fantasy, the idea of cancel culture. It's a dangerous phrase that evokes white supremacy and institutionalized racism. Get rid of words, censorship and cancel culture and discussions about cancel culture. So, so offensive, one person says, offensive books are like cars without seatbelts. Cars are recalled, not censored. It's not cancel culture, it's healing culture.
Right. Right. I mean, I don't personally agree with that. Maybe some other people will.
You don't have
right?
to comment. Maybe I'll just leave it to myself. Either you agree with, some people might agree with that.
Yeah. I will say, just as food for thought, right? One thing that I have noticed after the Charlie Kirk assassination, right? And there was a large group of right-wing people on social media, even people who had sort of built their reputations campaigning against wokeness and stuff, demanding that writers be fired from, places like The Nation or whatever for writing obituaries that were like critical of Charlie Kirk. And when they were accused of being hypocrites, like these folks who have spent years campaigning against cancel culture and wokeness, now trying to like cancel someone quite literally, right? They were actually using a very similar language. They were saying like, this isn't cancel culture, this is accountability culture.
Yeah.
This is holding people responsible for what they say, right? This is, First Amendment doesn't guarantee your right to have a job. This isn't censorship. I think if you sort of zoom out at the broad level, the left and the right actually have a lot in common in terms of how they rhetorically frame things. When it's your side trying to get someone fired, right? That's censorship and cancel culture. When it's our side, it's, fighting racism or protecting kids or sort of like whatever more, euphemistic way, maybe you want to describe it?
So in the US, where it's more softer in the publishing industry, they will say, or progressives will say, it's not canceling because it's not legislated. It's not the government doing
For
it. This
sure.
is, these are private businesses making decisions. It's part of the market. I
Mhm.
can't. We got to discuss the actual research you did doing experiments on people, and we got to get to Allen Ginsberg, his poem "Supermarket in California." Can you unpack the actual experimental social research you did there and what you found? Because I think there's some maybe just insights or questions about that we can reflect on ourselves. And a lot of authors throughout this summit have talked about being nervous and so on. So, you know, there's some insights into our human nature that I think are interesting. And so go there for us, please.
Sure, yeah. So I'll give you the SparkNotes version. So, with a few of my colleagues at the Social Dynamics Lab at Cornell, a few of my colleagues in the sociology department, basically when I was observing sort of what was going on in literary culture, where all of a sudden an author no one has ever heard of gets pounced on by like 4,000 people on X and is accused of being a racist or a sexist, and this happening with books that haven't even come out yet. So it's like, how many people even read the book in question, right? So me observing that, I sort of had the question like, to what extent is this sort of just like social influence, social contagion, what we call it, which is like, everyone's pouncing on this person. I'm going to pounce on them too, right? In the same way, everyone's listening to this new song. I'm going to listen to it too and say it's awesome, right? So basically, what we did is we took four poems, three of which had been accused of transgressions in the real world, like racism, sexism, and then one poem that had not. The one poem that had not is a poem. It's called Supermarket in California. It's written by Allen Ginsberg, deceased poet on the left, gay guy. It's just a poem about shopping in the grocery store, right? So what we did is we had a random sample of Americans, hundreds, who we gave these four poems to, and they would read the poems, and then we would ask them their opinion of the poems, and we would give them 16 word choices, of which they would pick three. So the word choices were everything from like aesthetic words to political words. So it could be, it'd be like well written, poorly written, racist, anti-racist, progressive, conservative, what have you. Right. And what we found was in all four cases, the overwhelming majority of people, like people are not reading these poems as racist or sexist, even though some of them have been the subject of public ire for ostensibly being racist or sexist. It was like, 90, 95%, 96% of people, like no one's clicking, this is a racist poem, right? So that sort of confirmed my suspicions that a lot of these quite literal cancellations, right? It is a group of people leveling these accusations who aren't really representative of readers overall. Um, so that was one thing, right? So the second question was like, can we push people to start accusing literature of being racist, of being sexist, and so on? So we took another group of people, we gave them the same four poems, but the one difference was I ghost wrote some criticism of each poem, just a couple sentences. And I attributed it to a literary critic. So this time people would get the poem, but next to it, it would say something like, this literary critic has said this poem is offensive to African Americans because it's whatever. Just a couple sentences, right? Readers were also told that at the conclusion of their reading, they may be asked to log into a Facebook discussion group where their real identity would be revealed, and they would have to actually talk about the word choices they picked, right? So like if they accused a poem of being racist or well written, like they would actually have to justify that response, and their face, would be present. And what we found was in that context, the number of people accusing a poem of racism or sexism or anti-Semitism, what have you, it absolutely skyrockets, right? And it doesn't even matter if the poem has been accused of that, like in a real world sense. So With Allen Ginsberg, I think it was about 34% of people clicked this is a homophobic poem simply because I made up a critic who just leveled some totally groundless accusations against the poem, right? So that, I mean, that was pretty jarring. Again, not to say that work that has been accused of these transgressions in the real world, not say it's, it's not warranted in certain contexts and things like that, but it did sort of at an empirical level suggest that there is like a huge social influence component to this stuff of people sort of being pushed to agree with the accusations, right? And I think it's telling, right? So if you look at the hashtags that have trended in the moment, right, one of them is silence equals violence. And I recall interviewing an agent, a very prominent agent who, if I told you the author she represented, 99% of you would be like, I read something by that person. She told me that one of her authors had become the momentary subject of ire on social media. And one of her friends, also in publishing, was kind of like, oh man, what is happening to your author? That's awful. Like, that's totally groundless and stuff. And she was like, yeah, thank you. I appreciate the support. And then she saw her friend actually like one of the attacks against her author. And she called out her friend. She was kind of like, what is that about? Like, you told me these were just groundless accusations that didn't have any merit. And her friend was kind of like, yeah, they are, but I don't want to be accused of just being silent and not saying anything. So, I don't want to be accused of being on the wrong side of history or being sympathetic to racism or what have you. So, I think that conversation with that agent sort of confirmed what we found in our lab, which is, just because you're on the left or just because you care about literature and diversity and sensitivity, it doesn't mean like all of a sudden you're outside some of these like kind of perennial human dynamics that have been reported on for like hundreds of years.
Yeah, we're pack animals, and I think it's important to think about it for ourselves. Whatever our political suasions are, is we're all subject to this kind of human nature. You quote American Journal of Sociology. I love that you're quoting sociologists. I have one course shy of sociology major, and glad to hear some being quoted. So people enforce unpopular norms to show that they have complied out of a genuine conviction and not because of social pressure. So in their experiments, people publicly enforce norms that they privately actually oppose. So
Mhm.
it's kind of the witch hunt dynamic. So, okay, so you basically showed it's interesting that you got that approved ethically. I remember the ethical standards, and of course there was the old, what were they called? The old experiments where the people with lab coats would like start people would start
Like the
screaming, and they
Stanley
and
Milgram experiments of like
the
the
Milgram
same.
ones, yeah, yeah, and people will just keep torturing people if they're told by an expert, or I think there's been some with reality TV been done more recently. Okay, so and with Allen Ginsberg went from like 2% calling it homophobic to like 30 something percent. So
Mhm.
pretty remarkable for a beatnik gay poet there. So okay, reactive devaluation. I do if anyone has questions about these, I know they're controversial topics. Anyone wants to ask questions, use the Q&A feature in the dot or please put them in there. Uh, you touch on this idea of reactive devaluation. I'm quizzing you on your book here. Do you remember what that means? I thought it was interesting.
Um, Now, can you give me the context?
Yeah, it's people dismissing ideas that they don't. If they're primed to say someone is the author of this right-wing sounding book,
Yeah,
if you're
yeah.
progressive, you're going to kind of just dismiss their opinion.
Yeah, yeah. So they've
I
done
think
a
that
bunch
was
of
it.
kind of fun social psychology experiments, right? Well, they'll you can do this without even saying that someone is a conservative or a progressive, right? So you could take like the same book about take a hot button issue like race or transgender people or what have you, right? And you could like show it to people and you show them like what the author looks like. And there's ways you can like code authors to sort of make them look more progressive, more conservative, right? So like the progressive stereotype of, guy kind of like me maybe, but with a man bun and earrings and nose ring, maybe some mala beads, right? And basically what you find, right, is kind of what we were talking about. People tend to just be sort of tribalistic creatures, right? And they're going to be more receptive to books and arguments, right? If it's coming from their tribe, their political tribe, right? And they're gonna be more reactive to devalue stuff that comes from people on the other side, right? So, I wrote my book in large part for people on the left, people in publishing who tend to overwhelmingly read left. There's a reason that I'm not trying to make my points by like appealing to Tucker Carlson or Jordan Peterson or whatever. I appeal to the sorts of people who these folks are going to be sympathetic to, right? So it's like one thing for, again, Bill O'Reilly to be saying we need to teach Huck Finn, and it's quite another when Toni Morrison says we should be teaching Huck Finn, even if it's a uncomfortable book and what have you, right? So yeah, I mean, it's a very real phenomenon. It's one of those things that um recurs, I think, in all contexts. And even if you want like comedic examples, right? So one thing like late night hosts have been doing for decades is they'll go out in the streets and they'll go to like a Trump rally and they'll say like, "Oh, Donald Trump wants to do X, Y, and Z," and people will be like, "Yeah, yeah, he should totally do that." And then they'll be like, "Oh, that's actually a Hillary Clinton platform or position, right?" And it works both ways. It's not like if you're on the left, all of a sudden you're way too smart for that or what have you. The point is obvious. We're social creatures. Social influence is a big part, right? And tying it back to publishing, right? There's a reason why the people work in the marketing, sales departments, et cetera. They always try to get ahead of the curve of the public response. So in the classic sense, this is, that coveted great book review in the New Yorker, like the Washington Post or what have you. But increasingly, people in publishing are relying on social media influencers. So people on Book Talk, Bookstagram. How do we get ahead of this before a book comes out, right? How do we create positive momentum for it?
Yeah, in Canada, we have big issues around reconciliation for Indigenous peoples. We've worked with a lot of really incredible Indigenous authors, but I've been trying to read. There's a big series of 6 reports on called the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. There's a summary book, but then there's also 6 other volumes, I believe. And I'm still very ignorant, all things considered. But what I have read, and there's in the politics of it, there's debates and proposals around denial, sort of like hate speech laws, but denialism related to residential schools here in Canada. But if you read a lot of some of the quotes within these reports, there's a lot of it where you see in the public, if a conservative says anything um, like that, they would get criticized very heavily. But if it's written in these reports, I mean, the reports they unpack a lot of things which it really couldn't be said politically by the wrong people. So interesting to see how it plays out. And of course, there's just politics involved, right? So each party is trying to make the other look the worst. So it's hard for the public to kind of keep their heads on straight and try to be involved in a civic conversation and to educate themselves. Um, okay, so we are getting near the end of our time. Do you want to touch on your writing and publishing journey? Or was it easy
Yeah.
for you to get published? Did you have to shop it around a lot? Did you go for a big 5? Uh,
So I mean, I've been writing like professionally, publicly since I think I published my first journalistic piece in like 2015, 2016. I mean, this book was rejected by multiple publishers. Some of whom quite explicitly told me they were worried about the backlash to it and that if I wanted to I mean, one publisher literally told me if I want to do another book first and like build up my sort of public platform and then come back to them with this book where it'd be like make more financial sense for them to like take a risk with me. I ended up at MIT because I wanted to keep my options open for potentially pursuing an academic career where the MIT press, would mean a lot more than Penguin Random House or Harper or whatever. Um, but yeah, I mean, I like most people, I was rejected by most publishers. I have an agent now, but been rejected by a number of agents. I would say my story is pretty similar to most people, which is just have thick skin, keep trying, keep submitting, and it's overwhelmingly going to be no's and rejections, but like at the end of the day, it's the few yeses that really count and shape the direction of your writing career.
And have you gotten much backlash or criticism? Some
Um,
hardships?
no, no, surprisingly not. I was kind of expecting to get trash more. I mean, I've gotten like maybe a couple snarky emails. I mean, I think my book's been reviewed in probably, I don't know, like 14, 15, 16 places. There was like two critical reviews, in places, way less read than the Washington Post and like the Economist and stuff. So, yeah, it's been surprising to me, people on kind of all sides of the political spectrum have responded favorably to it. I mean, me personally, that's not obviously like in a practical sense. I want my book to do well and so I can keep writing and whatever. But with a book like this, which I started writing in 2020, it's you don't really write this book um to make friends and sort of like appease everyone.
So, any questions? If we have any questions from the audience, send them through. Up next, we're going to have a panel discussion. Let's see here. Any questions, anybody? So, Stephanie Watterson asks, do you think other authors will be intimidated or relieved by the results published on the publishing sector?
Um what do they mean by results, do you think?
Maybe on representation, diverse representation. Do you think other authors will be intimidated or relieved by the results published, meaning the
Um
interviews collected and the studies?
Yeah, so kind of like the book as a whole, maybe.
Yeah, or maybe she means on just on what you've uncovered in the publishing industry. Are people kind of grateful that you're uncovering this? Or are they upset? Sorry, Stephanie, I may not be
Yeah.
getting the question right.
Um, yeah, so I would say, I mean, some of my interviews went on for, more than an hour, and in a lot of cases, I felt like I had assumed the role of like a pseudo therapist for like these people who are like working in publishing and stuff like that. Because as they themselves note, talking to me, like many of them don't feel comfortable sort of criticizing what's going on in the industry as a whole in their own publishing houses. So it was my sense that it was very much a relief for them to be able to talk about this stuff, and then to like see a book come out that is getting talked about, and sort of drawing attention to these issues. Now that said, on like the flip side of that, yeah, I think I think even my book's been blurred by people like Nadine Strawson, who was former president of the ACLU, like people like very who have spent their whole lives studying issues of free speech and things like that. And even like she was like, there's so many examples that I was not familiar with and things going on, right? And I think particularly if you're like an aspiring author, if you're not someone who's been sort of like grandfathered into the system, reading my book is probably going to feel like pretty cringy, especially with certain cases where it's like, how did this book, generate this much controversy and things like that? Um, I think that's that's kind of like a unfortunate reality right now.
Mark asks, do you see the intimidation from the left on social media or acquiescing in the publishing houses abating, or is it still as significant a challenge as ever?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think kind of like peak oil, there was probably a peak with this stuff around like 2020 or so, is my impression, but it still lingers, right? So like if I were to write a new prologue to like the paperback edition of my book, right? I can pull examples from this year of books being canceled and things like that, right? So like just Google what happened to the book series Sparrow and Vine when it was supposed to come out a few months ago, right? I could easily put that into the next edition of my book. But that said, it's my sense that, and this might be reflective of like the broader cultural shifts, particularly in the US, right? That things have cooled down a bit. I'll just be honest, I'm not sure my book would have been reviewed the same way in places like the Washington Post, for example, if it came out like 5 years ago. But I think there's a lot more, people feel a bit more comfortable like criticizing the stuff or, not acquiescing to it right now. But that said, right, it's not like this has like magically disappeared. I think especially in publishing, which is very left of center, but also, I mean, we haven't even talked about like creative writing programs, which are, in my opinion, like one of the main pipelines to a career as a writer. This stuff that I talk about in my book is still very prominent in all those spaces.
Peter Gribble asks, do you see any trends in books being called dangerous?
Yeah, I mean, there's very clear shit. Am I still on here? Oh,
Yeah,
sorry.
you
I thought
are. You're still there.
the window
You
I
get a
tried
bad.
to close another window and the Zoom disappeared, and then I heard your voice from the
I
like
thought
a
you got a
black
bad
bubble.
text or something or a bad message. You're in trouble.
Yeah, that's funny. Yeah, so I think if I had to like write a sort of like cautionary, manual for if your main goal is to like avoid a controversy, right? So like tends to target authors who are like writing outside their own demographic tends to be a common denominator. So if you're like Amelia Wenzel, you're Asian American and you're accused of writing something specific to African Americans, or Costco Jackson, you're writing about Muslims, you're not a Muslim, or if you're a white woman writing about whatever, that's a big one. And then the sort of issues again, there's no like mass attempt to cancel a book for representing, working class Americans the wrong way. They're very much focused around, I would say race is probably the biggest one. Gender/sexuality, the next biggest one. And then, to greater or to a less extent, other, identity categories like the folks who felt Roald Dahl should be edited because, his description of Augustus Gloop was fat phobic or what have you. So yeah, I mean, I think those two are the main ones, like writing outside your
Class.
own
Class is
demographic.
no longer. Class isn't the dimension through which these issues are talked
No, no, it's not. It's not the main subject of book controversies, and it's also not, you know, I have a not insignificant part of my book devoted to just like the economics of publishing and how, on the one hand, people will focus on the underrepresentation of African Americans or Asian Americans in publishing or transgender people or what have you, right? But there's a very clear economic component to who ends up working in publishing in New York City, right? You can go to indeed.com right now or LinkedIn, and look at some of those salaries, not just for starting jobs, but for like associate editors and stuff at like the most prestigious publishing houses. And you're looking at starting salaries of like $52,000 and you have to work in
in
Manhattan,
New York
right?
City.
Yeah, in Manhattan or Brooklyn. And then it's the question of like, well, who could actually afford to do that, right? And the easy answer is like probably someone who has a, parental safety net, right? And it's not just that. You can look at, again, like go to LinkedIn, start looking at companies, right? And it's like, where are they coming from? Well, they're often coming from the same 25 to 40 colleges and universities.
So that book is dangerous, and you talk about the 50s, you talk about the comic books, the moral panic around comic books. Who knows what it will be from either the conservative side or progressive side. Who knows what it will be in tenure? Maybe we'll be banning. You mentioned pinball machines were banned. Was
Mm.
it pinball machines
Yeah.
were banned
Yeah.
in
New
New
York
York?
City, they were banned.
They're just driving the kids up the wall and turning them into bad people. So that book is dangerous. Thanks for sharing your thoughts, Adam, and thanks for having the courage and even a bit of sensitivity in how you approach these topics. So good to meet with you, Adam, and thank you so much for sharing that. And where can people get your book if they want to learn more about these controversial but very very much current topics?
Yeah, Amazon, Barnes and Noble, wherever. So, yeah, thanks so much. I appreciate you guys making time for me.